Hi, this is Ken Wilber, and I'm delighted to be joining all of you. We're apparently on a bit of a tight time schedule here, so this will be a fairly short presentation. So, thinking of the large number of items I could comment on, I decided on a few brief statements about recent debates related to epistemology and ontology, which is focused basically on which of those is most important, or to be given predominance. Does epistemology determine ontology, a generally idealist position, or does ontology mostly ground epistemology, a classically realist position? My version of the integral approach is that both of these are equally existent and equally important. Neither is to be given a predominant stance. Rather, what you see if you look at the aqua framework with its 8 zones is that the more typically idealistic or subjectivist approaches are how the world looks from the inside zones, or the view from within. And the realist or more objective approaches result from looking at the world from the outside zones, or the view from without. Both are equally real, equally important, equally to be included, and neither privileged. But in most debates, alas, one or the other is usually privileged. What we see out there is a product not just of a given ontology of the item seen, but also of the methodology and epistemology we bring to see it. All of them are equally interwoven into the final result. This is not saying that the characteristics of the known object are fully created by the knowing subject. This is not an epistemic fallacy, and this is not subjective idealism. Simply that the characteristics of the object that are disclosed depend in part upon the means of disclosure. If we have an iron rod and we start heating that rod, there's no way to know that the rod is becoming hot by simply looking at it. Vision does not disclose the hotness. Touching, however, does. Touch it, change your methodology, and you will see the hotness is disclosed. Even more, if we look at the rod through an infrared detecting device, we will see the rod lit up and radiating in all directions. Those radiating fields cannot be detected by any human visual sense, but change the methodology, in this case with an infrared detecting device, and those fields are disclosed. Saying there is just a single rod in existence is to privilege one or more detecting methodologies or types of epistemologies. We could say the single rod is what is disclosed by the sum total of detecting devices used on it, and that would be fine, as long as we include human epistemology in the equation of detecting devices, and then realize that the epistemological subject itself goes through upwards of a dozen different real levels of development. And each of those levels will see something different about the rod and its surroundings. The first thing developmental studies teaches you is that each level sees a different world. So we have a magenta rod, an elemental spirit, a red rod, tool of a power god, an amber rod, creation of an almighty creator, an orange rod made of atoms and molecules and crystals, a green rod made of multiple quarks, a turquoise rod made of 11th dimensional strings, and so on indefinitely. Every rod that we know is the product of the ontology of the rod at that level, and the methodology used to detect it at that level, and the epistemology used to know it at that level. All three of those are inseparable aspects of the single wholeness of whatever the rod actually is. There is no such thing as the rod, as each evolutionary level discloses something new. The alternative is to say we will know the ultimately real rod at the end of time, when all the known methodologies would have been discovered and used, and the highest level of evolution would have been reached for epistemology, and the sum total of all those would be the ontologically real rod. But if we say that, then, of course, we never have anything resembling any sort of truth ever. Because until the ultimate truth is reached at the end of evolution, everything we know is shot through with some sort of falsehood. Because it's not the ultimately real rod seen only at the highest end of evolution itself. Far from anchoring our ontology, as virtually all realist schools attempt to do in this fashion by ontologically postulating the given rod, we have actually destroyed ontology, destroyed any hope of ever having any truth at all, because evolution never ends, and thus will the really, really real rod therefore never disclose itself. Rather, each whole rod, a phenomena consisting of a particular epistemology times a particular methodology times the ontology thus disclosed at any given level, is a true version of the rod at that particular level. If all the given phenomena at that level are fully taken into account, and then the best possible view of the rod is determined given the actual realities of that particular aqual address. This is similar, not quite identical, to the way Hegel put it. Every level is adequate, every higher level is more adequate. So here we have, every level is true, every higher level is more true. Thus, truth is a sliding evolutionary scale, with each level capable of truth, and each higher level capable of a wider truth. Any other option, from realist to idealist to materialist to positivistic, unconvincingly privileges a component of this overall process. So, we mentioned zones in this regard. Some examples will show the importance and reality of this distinction between the inside view and the outside view of each zone. Two of the most important theorists in postmodern theory are Heidegger and Foucault. And while both of them acknowledge the reality of the intersubjective, lower left quadrant, view, they did so from exactly the inside versus the outside views of that quadrant. Dreyfus and Ravenel do an excellent job of summarizing Foucault's approach and differentiating it from Heidegger's. Quote, Foucault's devotion to the description of concrete structures understood as conditions of existence bears a striking similarity to what Heidegger, in Being and Time, called an existential analytic. But there's an important difference. For although both Heidegger and Foucault attempt to relate the factical principles which structure the space governing the emergence of objects and subjects, Heidegger's method is hermeneutic or internal, whereas Foucault's is archaeological or external. Foucault is explicitly rejecting both Husserlian phenomenology and Heideggerian hermeneutics when he opposes to the exegetical account the exteriority of the archaeological account. It could hardly be put plainer. In regard to the lower left quadrant, Heidegger is focusing on zone 3, the inside or eternal of the collective interior. Foucault on zone 4, the outside or external of the collective interior. The view from within and the view from without. We can see precisely the same thing in today's battles between the different schools of systems theory. Virtually all of them make the prior judgment that the ultimately really real reality is the lower right quadrant, the sum total or whole or collective of all objective, interwoven, dynamic its. But when they split almost down the middle as to which view within the lower right is the truly real perspective. The inside, cognitive, inactive, autopoietic, relative, versus the outside, objective, rational, universal, realist. Those who choose the inside view will put a great deal of emphasis, sometimes a total emphasis, on the creative power of the interior, cognitive, subjective, inactive capacity of the organism to create or co-create its own reality environment. Thus, well-respected evolutionary researcher Bickerton maintains that what any organism sees, including humans, depends upon its evolutionary history, and thus all knowing is species-specific, that is, subjective inside. There is simply no, quote, objectively single and real view of a reality that is out there. As he puts it, again quoting, "It is meaningless to talk about a true view of the world. To maintain such a view, a minimum prerequisite would be for the viewer not to belong to any particular species. It is absurd to speak about a true view of the world, because it is not true for any creature that what it perceives is the world itself. What constitutes any creature's view is essentially a system of categories." In other words, an inactive, co-created inside view. As Kenneth Bosch summarizes this view in the emergent consensus in social systems, quote, "Our representations have no reality independent of our minds and languages. They do not represent an existing reality that is present to us. In the course of evolution and ontogeny, we have fabricated these representations, imposed them on our experience, justified them, and come to rely upon them. With all these representations, however, and all our refinements of self-observation, self-description, reflection, and theories of reflection, we never achieve a privileged access to knowledge. We remain bound to self-observation," end quote. In short, from this perspective, which is zone 7, the lower right seen from within, there is no single pre-given true outside view, because there is no single pre-given outside. There is only the ways that organisms co-create its outside reality environment according to its own systems of autopoietic cognitions. This perspective is the way reality actually looks to somebody emphasizing a collective inside view. That is, somebody viewing reality via Zone 7. And especially given the impact of autopoiesis theory, it is a very common view in modern systems theories and evolutionary theories. This view maintains in various ways that the structure of the knower subject is fundamental in creating, co-enacting the ontology of the given object. And indeed, there is no pre-given single reality that is simply out there awaiting perception by all and sundry. What we call reality is primarily co-enacted by the perceiving organism and its culture, and otherwise has no substantial characterizable existence. Critics of this inside view typically charge it with the epistemic fallacy, the putative fallacy being the idea that the structure of the subject has a substantial hand in the formation of the ontology of any object it knows. The view charging and criticizing this epistemic fallacy is generally held by all those who adopt the opposite stance. That is, the outside, realist, objectivist view, which we'll discuss in a moment. For my particular version of integral meta-theory, both of these views are true but partial, depending primarily on the perspective or view or zone that one takes. So we do acknowledge a real ontology, but this is the way reality looks only from the outside views. The inside views instead tend to see autopoietic, co-enactive, co-creative realities. Both of those are real. And integral meta-theory refuses to choose just one and reject the others. Doing that is just a perspective absolutism. As for systems theory dividing almost evenly into inside and outside approaches, Kenneth Bosch, author of that overview of today's systems theories, himself points out clearly that almost exactly half of systems theorists present what he variously calls a, quote, inside, co-creative, enactive, autopoietic view, while the other half adopt a given, quote, objective reality view, outside, universal, given, realist, giving us the two major views on the nature of systems themselves, inside enactive and outside realist. We just saw these two views of inside and outside in the lower left with Heidegger and Foucault. Now we see them in the lower right with the two main schools of overall systems theory. As Bosch points out, there are today, quote, two grand unifying theories of present-day systems theory: complexity, bifurcation, component systems, and two, autopoiesis, which he also points out are exactly the outside, realist, objective, reality view, and the inside, enactive, co-creative, autopoietic view. So the first approach is the more standard dynamic systems theory, which includes a wide variety of approaches such as general systems theory, cybernetics, dissipative structures, component systems, chaos theories, complexity theories, and so on. As we will see, dynamic systems theory is often called the outside view because it attempts to give the overall total view seen from the outside, detached, objective, systemic, universal. The second major approach attempts to give an account not of the system seen from without by a detached or scientific observer, but the inner choices made by an individual organism as it actively participates with and enacts its environment. So in trying to understand the cognition of a frog, for example, the first thing Maturana and Varela did, which shocked the biological community, was get rid of traditional systems theory. Because whatever the frog was thinking, it was not thinking about systems theory. Rather, the frog's cognition and its world consisted of specific cognitive choices the frog makes as it enacts and co-creates its surroundings. This is why they called their project Biological Phenomenology and the View from Within, hence the enactive paradigm. This is the autopoietic perspective, also specifically called the inside or cognitive view. By the way, all of those terms, autopoietic, cognitive, inside, and systems, rational, outside, are the terms used by the theorists themselves, including inside and outside. My point, of course, is that they are respectively and actually focusing on different zones, the inside versus the outside zones in any quadrant. For the systems view in the lower right quadrant, focusing on zones 7 and zones 8, respectively, with both being true when addressing their own zone. So we have an objective, realist, outside view, and an autopoietic, enactive, cognitive, inside view. And virtually all of present-day systems theory is divided almost equally between those two major views. Some people are confused at the use of rational and cognitive in that scheme, because often those two words mean the same thing. So why in this case are they diametrically opposed to each other? As employed by the theorists themselves, cognition is not used to specifically mean rational or intellectual, but in its wider and more inclusive meaning, which is any organism's attempt to register its environment. For example, an amoeba reacts to light, so it has a rudimentary cognition of light. But it does not, of course, have a rational view of light. In this sense, if I take a cognitive view of biology, a la Varela and Maturana, then I will try to explain from the inside view of the organism the types of reactions, behaviors, and cognitions that the organism itself makes as it encounters, enacts, and brings forth its world. This is also sometimes called biological phenomenology, a phrase Maturana and Varela themselves used, because it attempts to describe the phenomenal world of the organism itself. This is what the autopoietic approaches, pioneered by Maturana and Varela, attempt to do. And Maturana and Varela actually call their approach, as we saw, the view from within, and they explicitly exclude any form of dynamic systems theory from their view, since no biological organism actually has that view, except the human scientific organism. And it's allowed for them. Thus, the autopoietic, cognitive, enactive, co-creative, inside view. This view accuses the outside objective realist schools of committing the ontic fallacy, the belief that the basic structures of the knowing process is created by or dependent primarily upon the object as it is reflected on or known by the knowing subject. That object is really real, given, single, intransitive, and universal. It may be interpreted in different ways, but it is, underneath all that, one and the same object. And the aim of all true knowledge is to accurately reflect or represent this pre-given ontology. And that is exactly what is denied by virtually every inside and active view approach. The inside and active view also charges this realist objectivist view with, quote, the myth of the given. The myth that there is, in fact, at some level, a single intransitive pre-given world, just waiting to be known by one and all. That pre-given world might be confused, misinterpreted, covered up, or denied, but is still the same single pre-given world or ontology. Most realist schools claim to be plugged into this ontology one way or the other and at some point or another. Rational is merely one type or level of cognition. As used by these theorists, it means the rational activity of the theorists themselves as they attempt to explain phenomena in terms of, say, complex systems of dynamic mutual interaction. In this general systems approach, the rational outside approach, the attempt is not made to get inside any organism, but to stand back and try to see the whole picture, the total system or web of relationships as they interact with each other. Nobody, they point out, has ever actually seen the web of life. The web of life is a rational notion that ties together all of the independent streams into what is maintained to be a single wide web of life. Although, again, nobody has ever seen that. That's a rational assumption. And that's why the standard systems theories are often referred to as rational, because they are postulating these broad interactive realities that can't actually be felt or seen or otherwise known. But there's every rational reason to assume they're there. The autopoietic approaches don't do that. So the rational view is not saying that the web of life is merely a rational entity, but simply that scientists and other theorists attempt rationally to study that web. This rational third-person view is only taken by the scientists or theorists themselves. Only a scientist sees a big picture systems view. It is definitely not the cognition of, say, a frog, an amoeba, or a deer. Thus, the systems, rational, universal, objective, realist, outside view. These are these two views. So this is the view, this rational outside view, that charges the inside subjective autopoietic views with the epistemic fallacy. The putative fallacy that substantial aspects of the known object are imposed, enacted, co-created by the structure of the knowing subject, instead of there being one fundamentally real ontology, which no matter how many different ways it might be interpreted, is basically the same single, invariant, universal, intransitive reality. So what we see are these two basic, historically dominant, fundamental views of epistemology and ontology. And we see examples of them in all four quadrants, representing the inside and the outside of the zones in all four quadrants. And the integral claim is that they are all right, all correct, to the extent they are adequately describing their particular zone. With, of course, the inside autopoietic subjective views focusing on zones such as 5 and 7, and the realist objective outside views focusing on zones such as 6 and 8. Each view is right or correct when it is focusing on its particular views or zones, and assume it's doing it correctly, of course. And if so, then it has a true but partial reality, and this needs to be included in an overall integral approach. And possible views are false or incorrect when they violate the exclusion principle and criticize other views for what they're supposedly doing wrong, such as an inside view charging all outside views with the Autopoietic fallacy, or an outside view charging all inside views or inactive views with an epistemic fallacy. For integral meta-theory, the epistemic fallacy applies only to any over-application of the inside view, which occurs when the subsisting aspects of the outside objective reality are denied entirely or made to totally depend upon human knowledge. In other words, the epistemic fallacy is the idea that there is only the inside inactive world and all objects are nothing but enacted, which is simply not true. Every quadrant, after all, has an inside and an outside. How much clearer could that be? And the Autopoietic fallacy for integral meta-theory applies to any over-application of the outside or realist view, when the significant additions, creations, and inactions of the structure of the knowing subject are totally denied and their inactive impacts glibly charged with an epistemic fallacy. Occasionally you'll find philosophical schools attempting to integrate both these realist and inactive approaches, but only integral meta-theory that I am aware has an actual account of their origins, with, namely, the aqua framework with its 8 zones. As for that sliding scale of truth, the idea that each level is true, each higher level is more true, this is, as I said, a direct result of taking developmental studies seriously. As noted, the first thing you learn in developmental studies is that each level sees a different world. There are only 2 ways you can handle that. One, you can claim that there is still only a single pre-given reality, and each level is seeing this reality more clearly. But if you do that, then we will never have a real truth, since the real truth will only be seen at the end of development and evolution altogether. And since evolution never ends, that would mean never. On the other hand, you have what I call the sliding scale of truth. With developmental studies, we already have abundant evidence of this. We already have evidence that each level is conscious, each higher level is more conscious. Each level is loving, each higher level is more loving. Each level is moral, each higher level is more moral. Each level has an identity, each higher level has a wider identity, and so on, almost ad infinitum. Well, just so, each level is true, each higher level is more true. Just think of how the world 500 years from now is going to look back on our truths. So in tribal times, with a typically red pre-operational cognition, and in mythic traditional times, with a commonly amber concrete operational cognition, no individual was aware of atoms. For those times, atoms simply did not exist. Not in anybody's awareness, that is. With the emergence of orange formal operational cognition and its associated methodologies, atoms were discovered and began to exist in the awareness of numerous individuals. With the emergence of green pluralistic cognition and associated methodologies, multiple quarks were discovered. And with a unifying Kiel cognition, the eightfold way unifying quarks was brought forth. With a highly sophisticated turquoise cognition, items like string theory and M theory entered the picture. Each level is true, each higher level is more true. And this is as true can be. It's the only possible way a genuine and meaningful version of truth can exist with the occurrence of an all-pervasive evolution. So by recognizing that this integral unity of inside subjective and outside objective views in all four quadrants with all 8 zones gives us a sliding scale of truth. Each level is true, each higher level is more true. Then each level is allowed to know a real truth as true can be, as best as it can, at its time, with its given tools and techniques, be adequately known. That is truth as far as it can have any actual or real meaning at all. And all of these can be expected to grow and evolve and thus make more truth at each higher level, which does not deny truth as it presents itself at any lower level, but simply situates it within a total wholeness of reality in which epistemology and ontology, inside and outside, are 2 aspects of the same underlying, unfolding wholeness. In this way, and this way only, can we escape epistemic and ontic fallacies. And in this way only can these 2 archetypal enemies, idealism versus realism, spiritualism versus materialism, subjective versus objective, empirical versus rational, epistemic versus ontic, realist versus inactive, both be fully acknowledged and fully integrated. And lastly, this points to a fundamental maxim of integral approaches. Wherever you find 2 starkly opposed opposites, such as realism and inaction, look for a way to synthesize them, because the truth is always in the underlying wholeness, endlessly. Well, there's obviously an enormous amount of items that need to be said in this regard, but time is about up, so I'm going to have to wind this down. Many of you have kindly asked what I've been up to, so I'll briefly mention where my work is right now. As some of you know, I had a few-year hiatus as I wrestled with some health issues. Those have now subsided in the worst ways, I'm happy to say. And during that period, I didn't write or work much for 2 or 3 years. But now I'm back to writing, and in a strong way. I have, in fact, around 7 or 8 books, all already in the publication lineup. I've released a small publication as an e-book from Shambhala called The Fourth Turning. The next book, due out this December, is called Integral Meditation, and it's an attempt to unite exercises from the path of growing up with those from the path of waking up. Probably the first time in history that those 2 paths have really been systematically brought together. Then there's a very long, very detailed book, about 900 pages, called The Religion of Tomorrow, which is a fully integral approach to spiritual theory and practice and how I see religion unfolding if it's to have a future at all. Next up, and at the publishers now, is finally the follow-up to Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, or Volume 2 in the Cosmos Trilogy, which is called Sex, Karma, creativity. Another 900-page tome, I'm afraid. And sex in the title of this volume also is just a silly kind of inside joke. I swore I would make the first word in each book of the Cosmos trilogy sex, because sex sells. I don't know. Then 2 books on developmental studies in general, overview and superview, each around 500 pages. And last, another trilogy, which I'm just calling, for now, the Terrorist Trilogy. It deals with exactly that issue, terrorism in all its forms. These 3 books give a great deal of attention to the lower quadrants, which I've focused on less in the past, although Volume 2 of the Cosmos Trilogy also gives the lower quadrants, the we space and the its space, considerable attention. It's been wonderful being with all of you, even if briefly, and I wish all of you the very best in this exciting and ongoing integral adventure. Thank you.